justice advocate, serving as program director and core faculty at Michigan School of Psychology. His work integrates humanistic, existential, multicultural, and eco-psychological perspectives with particular emphasis on Black existentialism, climate psychology, environmental justice, and community-oriented advocacy. Dr. Sebree currently serves as president of the APA Division 32 Society for Humanistic Psychology and has held numerous leadership roles within national psychological organizations. In addition to his teaching and leadership work, he provides clinical services and consultation focused on multicultural identity, social justice, and relational healing practices. With that, let's welcome Dr. Sebree.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with all of you. Thank you for the invitation. Especially as the weather decided, we maybe needed a little bit more rain today. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about advocacy, really an advocacy from, I think, a humanistic perspective. And really advocacy as like learning, right? Like advocacy as, I think, a pillar when it comes to community-centered learning. Okay, so kind of talking a few things, like why does humanistic advocacy matter? And particularly like in my field of mental health, why does that really matter? But also talking about what does it mean to build community-centered learning environments, but also what is that practical leadership and policy and training implications for these pieces as well. Okay, so why this matters now. So when I do a lot of work in clinical training, so at the Michigan School of Psychology, I am the master's program director, and so we train a lot of clinicians for really the state of Michigan and regionally. But what we tend to see is there's a lot of burnout, right, in the mental health field, for instance, and also a lot of uncertainty and imposter syndrome, because people are like, wait, I'm supposed to talk to people about their issues. How am I supposed to do anything? What am I gonna do? It's like, well, your job is to be there to listen. Like, your job isn't to fix. But we also tend to see educational systems can prioritize compliance over growth, right? And so saying, hey, are you checking these boxes off, right? Rather than, can you engage people in a manner with critical thinking, with empathy, with relational skills. And so I tend to focus on humanistic pedagogy because it creates spaces where there's creating spaces based on safety, dignity, belonging, and action, right? And so saying, hey, we're all gonna be here, like in this space today, and we're going to come here because we want to learn and we want to engage with each other, right, as we move forward. So a lot of it, like when I think about positioning ourselves in our work, right? And so positioning being about like praxis. So praxis being more than just saying, okay, here's my theory and here's my values, but okay, how am I living that? How am I bringing that into my everyday life? And so a huge part of my work, especially with students and communities, is, okay, how do we take a lot of those pieces and move it into action for you? And so a lot of my work in just psychology and education has been very focused on equity, development, growth, personally, professionally, in that sense as well. And then also advocacy, right? That's informed through dialogue. It's informed with dialogue through students, communities, and just colleagues and other groups in general, right? Like, I remember going to a conference in Raleigh, North Carolina. They had invited me out, and I was presenting on these topics and talking about climate psychology. And they have a huge coastal erosion issue in North Carolina. And this was right before the hurricane had hit, maybe like 2 weeks before the hurricane hit. And they were talking a lot about, okay, we have these communities and they really need our help, right? We're the scientists, we're the educators, but we don't understand why they won't let us in. And one of the first things I said is, did you ask them what they need? Did you talk to them? Did you introduce yourselves? And they said, yeah, we get that empathy, but how do you get them to let us come in and do the work? And it just totally went over his head. And I just kind of said, yeah, kind of going back to what I said before. And I don't think it kind of quite landed in that time we were talking. But it's a common thing I see, particularly among scientists, practitioners, is, hey, we know how to do this stuff, but why won't people let us just come and do the stuff? And it's like, because these are people's lives. These are their homes. These are their communities. You can't just come in and say, we know what we're doing, let us do that. Right? So how do you build relationship? And so when I talk about humanistic pedagogy, I often talk about relational presence and authentic encounter. Right? Like, I'm coming here as myself. I'm not coming here behind the label of whatever it may be, right? I'm coming here person to person saying, okay, how can I help you? Right? How can I be a part of this relationship? And part of that, I think, is respect for dignity. But we also say subjectivity and lived experience, right? Like, one community's lived experience is different from another community's. You can't really change that, right? And to say, oh, that doesn't matter, that's not a part of the whole equation, right? You're really missing a huge part of what makes those people, right? What makes them, who they are in their everyday life. And so we often talk about dialogical learning, so learning through dialogue, being able to have discussions, being able to talk, right? It's not just, hey, we're gonna come in, here's what we're gonna do, and leave us alone, right? It needs to be more of a conversation, and an ongoing conversation. And so part of that is because that supports agency, and really the growth process, right? Like, okay, this is your community, what do you wanna see? What do you see as the problems, right? Rather than saying, okay, we're gonna come in, we've already identified these problems based on our own research, and now we're just gonna take, whatever steps we wanna take. And why this matters, particularly in my line of work, I think, because it extends beyond the classroom, right? I'm talking to students daily, and the world is a scary place right now for a lot of people. And so they sit there and say, well, what am I supposed to say to somebody who's experiencing hardship or experiencing oppression, and I'm their therapist? Am I supposed to just say like, oh, it'll be okay, knowing that it might not be okay, right? And how do I maybe take my efforts into work outside of the therapy room, outside of the classroom? So a lot of my work, like particularly recently in the last several years, has been working with, so I work with the Michigan Psychological Association. I'm their advocacy committee chair. So a lot of the needs for mental health advocacy tend to come across my email desk. In particular because you've got legislators who, they might not have as good of a connection to their constituents in their communities. And so then that means, oh, there's this bill that's coming across our desk, and oh, look, we're talking about changing access to mental health care, maybe adding more barriers. And to them, they're like, oh, okay, well, I don't understand why that would be a problem. And so there's been many times where I've even sat in congressional offices, and either on Zoom or sometimes in person, and just frankly said, hey, I serve these communities, I serve these different, populations of folks, and here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I see and how people tend to be affected by these kinds of policy changes. And people tend to listen to that because they go, oh, well, one, they're like, oh, my constituents, so these are the people who voted for me and would either vote for me or not vote for me again. Plus, they're like, oh, wait a second, Like, I didn't know this. Well, you wouldn't, because you don't really live that life, right? There's not that experience there. And so the importance of being able to say, like, how do we start to influence the systems and structures that are perpetuating some of these issues, right? And so a lot of that has been, over these last several years, is, providing a lot of either testimony or information a lot of the time to different staffers and offices so that they can make those informed decisions about policies. Right, and also, if we're talking humanistically, creating humane policies, right, that also reduce unnecessary barriers and support student development, community development, and individual development. And so part of my modeling, I think, is educationally is saying, hey, you guys are mental health, you're going to be mental health professionals eventually. You can do this stuff too, right? You can get out there. You can be a part of this, even now, right? Even as trainees. And that's a lot of my emphasis when I talk to students, right? And particularly when I'm talking to communities as well. It's like, it's, you all seem to be, more closely connected to this, but, a lot of times coming into spaces where people don't know that. They never had that experience. No one's ever come to them and talked to them about that, or given them even an approach to take. Right, so being able to say, hey, here's how you can start, advocating for yourself in ways that you want to. And so I think advocacy really requires a presence that's focused on dignity, right? How do you help communities recognize their own agency and live in their dignity? And that sense of being able to say, hey, this is, this is my life, right? And I want to be able to make changes and affect my world around me, right? I even love the piece about Love Canal because that is what they did. And part of it, that was out of necessity. Like, they did not have they had a choice, but the choice was not, one that was stacked very well for them, I think, right? Like, they had to do that in order to really provide for the future, right? For their children, for their communities. But I think a lot of that is where you get into grassroots work. Like, grassroots work is powerful, right? It's not always about some, giant super PAC of people who have, contributed a lot of money to a particular organization. Grassroots tends to bring a very strong voice, right? Because it is very centered on the lived experience of people in those communities, right? It's not some message that has been crafted by other people. And so part of that, I think, is it provides that transparent and really focused on compassion and developmental perspectives, right? Like, hey, this is about how do we grow this? How do we grow this community? How do we provide for our future, right? There's a lot of, I think, more authentic pieces tied to that when you tend to see it coming from a grassroots perspective. And also about building trust, right? Through that consistency, that attunement, and that accountability, right? Like, communities are there because they live together. They have experiences together. They have, elements of culture together. And a part of that also is we're also accountable for what's happening in our communities, what's happening in our environment, right? As you can see in the example of Love Canal. And so a lot of the work, I think, when it comes to grassroots systems is creating responsive systems, right? That say, hey, this community is engaged, right? And how do we continue that engagement? We provide avenues for engagement, right? So it continues to build on itself. And so for us, I think educationally, a lot of it is our training, right? Like, what are our expectations for students? What are our expectations for places where they go to train? It also means talking about equitable and transparent pathways for, hey, there's some issues going on. How do we heal that within the community framework, right? It doesn't mean the communities, even when they're addressing like some kind of cause, there isn't infighting, right? And particularly community infighting can be one of the biggest pieces that breaks grassroots movements apart, right? Because now you've got conflicting ideals and there's no repair, right? And so educationally, we might say remediation, but I think community-wise, it's also focused on repair, right? How do you continue to build and repair as you move forward? But also strengthening those support structures, right? Like, what creates belonging? You know, and as I see, you know, the Sunday Assembly, right? Like, you guys meet on a regular basis, you provide support to each other, right? Like, there is those built-in elements that create and continue to create, right, that relationship, that connection, and foster that community element. And so a huge part of my work lately has just been, I think on the leadership side, has just been focused on advocacy. Like, even as you heard in my bio, a lot of the relationships that I've had with different organizations, a lot of my work has been focused on advocacy. Like advocacy for, you know, various groups within that, really about just creating more equitable, I think, circumstances and practices for people. And so part of that has been really fostering psychological safety. And again, when I see like this group getting together, people knowing each other, having relationships with each other, right? It's creating that psychological safety that says, okay, now we can maybe challenge ourselves with some of this work. Maybe we can come together and create these different initiatives and things because we have that sense of safety in the group. And then when I think of the feedback systems, right, like how does a group or community continue to grow and integrate feedback from its community members, right? And that becomes a huge part, I think, of advocacy work, right? Like, okay, we're hearing this from one group of people. How do we start to integrate those pieces and say, yeah, you're right, maybe we do need to make a change to this, right? So that we can continue pushing forward with these efforts. And so part of that maybe is also culturally responsive structures, right? So that's saying like, hey, we want your feedback. It's built into the culture of the community, right? It's not ancillary, it's not something that's added as like adjunctive. And so typically with that work, it's a lot of work. I mean, really doing policy advocacy. Sometimes it means sitting up on Capitol Hill all day, talking to different staffers' offices, and just introducing ourselves and saying, hey, here's who I am, here's who I represent, and here's why this is important. Here's why I'm in your office. And sometimes that's within a span of 5 to 10 minutes, because that's maybe all the time that they have. They're like between meetings. And so you're trying to fit yourself in and make yourself known, right? And start to create that connection. Again, that relationship. And so when I think of the structural advocacy components, sometimes on my side, a lot of it is training people in advocacy. Right now it's educationally, that's a huge part of my, I think, teaching perspectives that I tend to bring to students is, hey, I want y'all to be aware that this is how you advocate for yourselves. This is how you begin to understand what it means to advocate for yourselves. This is where you find information on different bills. This is how you reach out to your congresspeople, right, your legislators. But also being able to build coalitions, right? I think building those strengthens those relationships, right? Because when you've got other groups that also say, hey, we also have the same values and goals, the voices become louder. And so when I think about a lot of the values-oriented pieces of this, the humanistic, I think, philosophy adds really the foundation, if I would say, right? Because justice, identity, and human becoming, right? That idea of human potential, right? And giving people the space, the environment, the resources to be able to recognize potential, rather than saying, okay, your environment your positioning is actually hurting that potential or that access to it, right? And so I think a lot of that means educationally, for people like me, my charge is making sure that that training continues to focus on addressing inequities, creating belonging, and addressing alienation. But also thinking about how elements of race, culture, and community shape education and various experiences for people. Right? Advocacy requires awareness of power, context, and collective responsibility. It requires all those pieces, right? Which maybe it's not one person holding all these things, right? If you've got a community, then it becomes different members hold different parts, right? And then it becomes about the collaboration. Okay. And so I would say flip some of these a little bit, but thinking about community practices and thinking about like what kinds of institutional practices in your communities tend to undermine dignity. Like what are the things that you are seeing in your own homes, in your own, context? Because I think that's always where it starts. Right? Without having that, I think, experience, we tend to not be grounded in the work as well, right? And this is, we tend to see that, like time and time again. But also, how can advocacy become part of everyday learning and leadership? And that's something I try to live by every day. Like, what can I do each day, right? Nothing big, it doesn't always have to be big, but what can I do that's small? Right, so advocacy is a practice of making room for somebody else's becoming. Right, like, hey, I'm gonna advocate for this group of kids over here because, I'm seeing that, they don't have the same access to things. Right, there's inequities there. But when I talk about humanistic pedagogy, I think it really calls us toward relational, ethical, and community-centered education. Like you can't separate the pieces. And then education is transformative when it supports liberation, dignity, and shared humanity. Thank you.
I was just thinking, like, how, I'm just a guy. I'm not in your profession. I don't, like, how can we apply some of this to what we're doing here?
Well, I think that's always the perfect question to ask ourselves every day, right? Like, I'd say part of applying it is really starting with saying, like, okay, what are issues that we're identifying in our own area that we want to support or advocate for, right? For some people, it's like, hey, thinking about the amount of environmental issues that are going on in the immediate area. Right? For some people, it might be access to different resources, right? So I think being able as a group to come together and say, okay, what are our top 4 priorities, right? What are we seeing, and what are the things that are impacting our members and our community, right? And what is personally relevant to us? Because that's where it starts, right? And then being able to say, okay, now, who's responsible for those pieces, right? Whether it's talking to local politicians or whether that's talking to, state reps, right? And part of it I'll say is how many folks here know who is their congressional rep for their area? That's where you start. Because as soon as they hear, I'm a constituent, they go, oh, okay, wait a second. Okay, we gotta pay attention to those pieces, right? Part of it is the power is held individually, but also collectively, right? And there's a lot of collective power in this space. I think part of it is identifying where is that power kind of seated, right? And what are those advocacy goals that you want to move toward?
More questions?
How receptive
I will say there's been some interesting kind of exchanges. I remember I did a bigger Capitol Hill visit, and it was related to the Inflation Reduction Act and climate change. And it was a national piece, and some of the folks in the Zoom room were like, raise their Zoom hand and are like, hey, I live in Texas, and so my senator is Ted Cruz, and he does not support these things, right? Like, so what do I do, right? I got to go talk to his staffers, and the thing that I think stands out amongst all of the work is the personal relevance, right? When you can say, here's my experience, here's the experience of people in my community, and this is how this is affecting us, then they go, oh, okay, right? Because it's not necessarily about arguing about the ideal of something. It's about, okay, no, this is the data, this is the anecdotes, and they tend to really hang on to anecdotes, right? And so when they hear multiple people saying that, then that starts to build up to something. Yeah.
I'm interesting, maybe it's a historical question, maybe it's sort of kind of a practical question, but psychology, therapy, it's such an individual thing. I go in, I feel sad, right? And there are always individual practices like meditation and focusing and finding your center. But really it's you can't almost excel into those areas without that social connection. So I'm wondering, part of it's professional question, and then part of it is what does that look like in a different world, right? What is yeah. You're nodding your head so you can.
Yeah, no, that's great, because I think that's a question that comes up pretty often. I think particularly because we get, like I was mentioning earlier, it's hard to say to somebody yeah, no, you shouldn't be feeling this way with everything going on. No, this is totally normal why you're feeling all of these emotions and all these pieces, right? We can then say what do you want to do with that, right? I think that's more on the professional side. I think the interesting part is because therapists and psychologists tend to have that very individual, okay, we're hearing stories, we're hearing these pieces, but then we end up with a whole ledger full of stories. And so we're the people that if we get in front of a congressperson, we can go, here, I can rattle off probably 20 different stories where this context is important, right? And that's 20 to 30 different people who have been affected by this, and now that is being imparted, right? I think for psychologists and therapists, we often become the go-between, right? In that sense of hey, let me relate this story, or let me relate these experiences to you and why this is important. Whereas, unfortunately, our clients don't always have that space or that energy or that time. So, yeah. Does that kind of answer? Okay.
Okay, so with that, let's thank our speaker.